The leather beneath Ethan's hands had gone stiff in the cold. He'd been working since before dawn, same as every day for the past 3 years, stitching silence into saddles and trying to forget what warmth felt like. The workshop smelled like tallow and old smoke, and that suited him fine. Smells didn't ask questions, didn't expect answers. Ethan. He didn't turn. Samuel Webb had a voice like a rusty hinge, always squeaking about something that wasn't his business. Ethan, you gotta come see this. I'm working. There's a woman. Then she ain't here for me. Ethan pulled the thread taut, felt it bite into the calluses he'd earned trying to work himself into numbness. 3 years of trying. Still wasn't numb enough. Says she is, though. Says she's your... Well, she's got papers. The needle slipped, jabbed into his thumb. Blood welled up dark. He watched it for a second, that bright hurt, then stuck his thumb in his mouth and finally looked at Samuel. The older man was practically vibrating in the doorway, frost in his beard, that hungry look people got when someone else's disaster was about to become entertainment. What kind of papers? The marrying kind. Ethan set down the saddle horn. I didn't send for anybody. She seems to think different. Got off the stagecoach about 20 minutes ago. Wouldn't go to the hotel. Said she was waiting for her husband. Samuel's grin was missing 2 teeth. That'd be you, apparently. The workshop suddenly felt smaller. Ethan stood, his knee cracking, old injury from a horse that had had more sense than he did. Where is she? Front of the mercantile, drawing a crowd. Of course she was. Nothing happened in Salvation Creek without half the town bearing witness. They'd made a spectacle of his grief 3 years back, brought casseroles and prayers he didn't want, watched him bury Sarah and the baby girl who'd never drawn breath. They'd been waiting ever since for him to either crawl out of his hole or dig it deeper. This, whatever this was, would keep them fed on gossip for months. The wind hit him like a fist when he stepped outside. February in Wyoming territory didn't negotiate. It took what it wanted, feeling from your fingers, sense from your head, hope from your chest. Ethan had made peace with that. He pulled his coat tighter and headed down the frozen main street. He saw her before he reached the crowd. Couldn't miss her, really. She stood out like a cardinal in a coal mine. Ridiculous red cloak, impractical boots, a carpet bag clutched against her chest like it might shield her from reality. Her face was pale, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell, but her chin was up. Stubborn. That would last about a day out here. The crowd parted when they saw him coming. Tom Bradshaw smirked. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl and made that clucking sound she probably thought was sympathetic. Reverend Matthews looked concerned, which meant he was about to make everything worse by trying to help. The woman turned. Her eyes were blue. Not sky blue, more like ice over deep water. The kind of blue that might have meant something to him once, before he'd learned that noticing things like that only set you up for losing them. Mr. Cross? Her voice had an edge to it, trying to sound confident and failing. Boston accent, educated, completely wrong for this place. That's right. I'm Clara Whitmore. She said it like it should mean something. When he just stared, she fumbled with her bag, pulled out an envelope. Her hands were shaking, definitely fear then, not just cold. I have your letters. You sent for me. We've been corresponding for 4 months. He didn't take the envelope. No, ma'am, we haven't. The certainty in her face cracked, just a little. But I have your letters, your handwriting. You told me about your work, about the town, about... She stopped, glanced at the crowd pressing closer, dropped her voice. About your loss, your wife and daughter. You said you were ready to try again, that you needed someone who understood fresh starts. Something cold slithered down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the wind. He snatched the envelope from her hand, tore it open. The letter inside was written in a careful hand he'd never seen before. But the words, Dear Miss Whitmore, your last letter brought me more comfort than I can express. The work keeps me busy, but the nights are long. I think often about what you said, about second chances, about building something new from broken pieces. I believe you're right. I believe I'm ready. I didn't write this. His voice came out harder than he meant. I never wrote any of this. She went white. Actually white. Like the blood had just decided to leave her face entirely. You must be mistaken. We've been 4 months of. She grabbed for the letter, scanned it like the words might have changed. This is your name, your profession, this town, the postmark. I don't care what the postmark says. I didn't write it. He shoved the letter back at her. Somebody's played you for a fool, and I'm sorry for that. But it wasn't me. But I sold everything. The words came out small. My aunt's house, the furniture. I spent everything I had to come here because these letters said, well, the letters lied. He knew he should feel worse about the way her face crumpled, but feeling things was dangerous, and he'd given that up. There's a hotel, Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house. You can stay there until you figure out what you're doing next. I don't have money for a hotel. Her voice had gone flat. I spent it on the journey. I thought I was coming to my husband. The crowd murmured, that low sound of anticipation when disaster was about to get worse. Ethan felt it closing in. The expectation, the weight of all those eyes waiting to see what the broken widower would do with the mail-order bride somebody had sent him as a joke. Or worse, not as a joke. As some kind of misguided charity. Who set this up? He raised his voice, turned to the crowd. Which one of you thought this was helping? Silence. Confused faces. Either they were all better liars than he gave them credit for, or this was something else entirely. Mr. Cross. Reverend Matthews stepped forward, that reasonable tone that meant he was about to suggest something unreasonable. Perhaps we should discuss this inside. The young lady has traveled a long way. She traveled a long way on somebody's lie. That's not my fault. Nevertheless, she's here now, and it's going to be dark soon. The temperature's dropping. The Reverend glanced at Clara, who was now shaking hard enough that Ethan could see it from 6 feet away. We can sort out the details once everyone's warm. The details are sorted. She needs to go back where she came from. With what money? Claire's voice had found some steel underneath the shock. You think the stagecoach runs on good intentions? The next one east doesn't leave for 3 days, and the fare is $6. I have 40 cents to my name. Then you'll work for it. Mrs. Carmichael always needs Mrs. Carmichael's full up. That was Tom Bradshaw, still smirking. Her sister's family came in last week. Won't have a room free until spring at earliest. Ethan shot him a look that should have set him on fire. Then somewhere else. Where? Clara demanded. You seem to think I have options, Mr. Cross. I don't. I'm standing in a town I'd never heard of 6 months ago, wearing every warm thing I own, which isn't enough, talking to a man who apparently doesn't exist, at least not the version who wrote me letters about loneliness and hope and second chances. Her voice cracked. So please enlighten me. What exactly am I supposed to do? The question hung in the frozen air. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and saw it. The terror underneath the anger, the absolute freefall of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. He'd seen that look before. In the mirror, 3 years ago, when the midwife had come out of the bedroom with her eyes already apologizing. He didn't want to see it now. Didn't want to feel the tug of it. Ethan, Samuel again, quieter this time. Storm's coming in. You can smell it. She won't make it through the night outside. That's not my problem. Actually, Reverend Matthews said, still in that careful voice, it is. She came here as your intended bride. You may not have sent for her, but she believed in good faith that you did. That creates a certain obligation. I don't recall asking for your sermon on obligation. You're a member of this community. She's a woman alone, without resources, in the dead of winter. If something happens to her, nothing's going to happen to her. But even as he said it, Ethan felt the trap closing. The Reverend was right, damn him. The whole town was watching. They'd remember if he turned his back, if he let her freeze or starve or worse. They'd remember, and they'd be right to remember, because whatever else he wasn't that kind of man. Wasn't supposed to be, anyway. He looked at Clara again. She was watching him now with something like hope, which made it worse. Hope was the cruelest thing you could give someone in a place like this. 3 days, he heard himself say. Until the stagecoach. You can stay at my place. I've got a spare room. The lie came easier than he expected. He didn't have a spare room. He had Sarah's sewing room, and he hadn't opened that door in 3 years. You keep to yourself. Don't touch anything. And when that stagecoach comes, you're on it. Understood? Relief flooded her face, and he hated it. Hated that he'd put it there. Yes. Thank you. I won't be any trouble. I promise. You're already trouble. Come on. He turned and started walking before anyone could say anything else, before the Reverend could look pleased, before the town could start making something out of this that it wasn't. He heard her behind him, her footsteps quick and unsteady on the ice. The carpetbag thumped against her leg. Nobody said anything, but he felt them watching, felt the weight of their judgment and speculation. His workshop sat at the edge of town, close enough to be convenient, far enough to discourage visitors. The house behind it was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen, a lean-to for storage. He'd built it himself back when he thought he was building a future. Now it was just a place to sleep between working. He pushed open the door and felt the cold inside. He hadn't bothered with a fire that morning, hadn't seen the point. Clara stepped in behind him and stopped. He saw her taking it in. The bare walls, the empty kitchen, the thin layer of dust on everything. The absolute absence of anything that suggested someone actually lived here rather than just existed. "It's not much," she said finally. "It's enough." He moved to the fireplace, started laying kindling. His hands knew the work without thinking. "Room's through there." He nodded toward the closed door. "Like I said, 3 days. Then you're gone." She didn't answer. When he glanced back, she was still standing by the door, clutching that carpetbag, looking lost in a way that made his chest tight. "You know how to make a fire?" Yes, in a fireplace. We had a coal furnace, but I can." "Good. You'll need to keep it going. Gets down below 0 at night." He struck the flint, blew on the spark until it caught. "There's more wood in the lean-to. You haul it yourself. I'm not your servant." "I didn't ask you to be. You asked me to be your husband. That's worse." Her face went red. "I didn't know. The letters said—" "I know what the letters said. I read them." He stood, brushed off his hands. The fire was starting to catch, throwing shadows that made the room feel even emptier. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to convince you I was something I'm not. Question is who and why." "I don't know." She set down the bag finally, wrapped her arms around herself. The first letter came to a matrimonial agency in Boston. I'd placed an advertisement. I was looking for a new situation after my aunt died. The agency said they'd found a match. A widower in Wyoming territory, respectable profession, owned property. They forwarded the first letter. After that, we corresponded directly. "You have the other letters?" "In my bag. All of them." "Let me see." She hesitated, then knelt and opened the carpet bag. The letters were tied with ribbon, blue ribbon, he noticed, and felt something twist in his gut, because that was exactly the kind of detail Sarah would have noticed, would have found meaningful. Clara handed them over. There were at least a dozen, all in that same careful hand. Ethan flipped through them, scanning the contents. Whoever had written them knew things, knew about Sarah and the baby, knew about the workshop, knew about the town well enough to mention names. Tom Bradshaw's gambling problem, Mrs. Henderson's arthritis, the hard winter 2 years back when they'd lost 3 families to influenza, someone from Salvation Creek. Had to be. "These are detailed," he said. "I thought they felt honest, like someone who'd really lived through loss and come out the other side." Her voice was quiet. "I know how that sounds now, naive. It sounds like you wanted to believe something." "I did." She met his eyes. "I was alone. My aunt raised me after my parents died, and when she passed, I had nothing. No family, no prospects. The house was mortgaged. I was going to end up in a factory, or worse. So yes, I wanted to believe that somewhere there was a man who understood what it felt like to lose everything, who might be willing to build something new with someone else who understood." The honesty of it caught him off guard. He looked away, back at the letters. "Well, that man doesn't exist. Not here, anyway." "Apparently not anywhere." The bitterness in her voice was earned. He couldn't argue with that. "I need to get back to work," he said, handing the letters back. "There's some bread in the kitchen, probably stale, coffee in the tin. Make yourself whatever you need." He moved toward the door. "Mr. Cross?" He stopped but didn't turn. "Why did you let me stay? Really?" Good question. He didn't have a good answer. "Because it's cold," he said finally, "and because whoever wrote those letters is a bastard. But that's not your fault." He walked out before she could say anything else. The workshop was colder than the house, but Ethan preferred it. He lit the small stove in the corner, more for the light than the warmth, and went back to the saddle he'd been working on. The leather was good quality. Tom had ordered it special for his prize mare, was willing to pay extra for detailed tooling. Ethan didn't care about the money, but he cared about the work. Work had a beginning and an end. Work made sense. Women showing up claiming to be your bride didn't make sense. He tried to focus on the stitching, but his mind kept circling back to those letters. The details bothered him. Anyone could have known about Sarah and the baby. That was public grief, mourned by the whole town. But the smaller things. The way he took his coffee black because Sarah had said adding sugar was wasteful. The scar on his left hand from the time he'd tried to break up a fight between two stallions. The fact that he couldn't sleep without a window open, even in winter. Those were private things. Things you'd only know if you'd been close to him, or if you'd been close to Sarah. The thought made him pause mid-stitch. Sarah had friends, women she'd talked to, confided in. Mrs. Henderson, who'd helped with the sewing. Young Mary Bradshaw, before she'd married Tom and moved to the ranch. Even the Reverend's wife, Elizabeth Matthews, who'd brought soup during the pregnancy. Had one of them done this? Sent for a mail-order bride thinking they were helping him? It felt wrong. Too elaborate. Too cruel, even if the intention was kind. He worked through the afternoon, letting his hands solve the problem of the leather while his mind chewed on the bigger problem. The light was failing when he heard the door open. "I said you should stay inside." "I brought coffee," Clara's voice. "You've been out here for hours." He turned. She'd shed the ridiculous red cloak and was wearing something more practical. A wool dress, dark green, probably the warmest thing she owned. She'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and was carrying a tin cup that steamed in the cold air. "I didn't ask for coffee." "I know, but I made some anyway, and it seemed wasteful to let it go cold." She set the cup on the workbench. "I also found the bread. You weren't lying about it being stale." "I don't lie. Someone does." She was looking at the saddle. "That's beautiful work. It's adequate. It's more than adequate. The detail on the tooling, I've never seen anything like it." He didn't know what to do with the compliment, so he ignored it, picked up the coffee instead. It was strong and hot, and better than he'd made for himself in months. "You didn't have to do this." "I know, but I'm going to be here for 3 days, and I prefer to be useful." She pulled the shawl tighter. "Also, I wanted to apologize." "For what?" "For the situation. For believing I could just show up here and—" She stopped, laughed without humor. "I don't even know what I thought would happen. That you'd take one look at me and decide the letters were right? That we'd just proceed as planned? Some mail-order marriages work out that way." "Do they? Really?" "So I'm told." He took another drink. "I wouldn't know." "Because you met your wife the traditional way?" The question was casual, but he heard the curiosity underneath. Natural enough. She'd read all about Sarah in those damn letters. Probably felt like she knew things about him that she had no right to know. "I met Sarah at a barn dance. She stepped on my foot, apologized 6 times, then stepped on it again. I figured anyone that determined to cripple me was worth getting to know." Clara smiled just a little. "She sounds lovely." She was. The words came out flat, final. He set down the cup. "You should get back inside. Temperature's dropping." "What about you?" "I've got work to finish." "It's almost dark." "I know what time it is." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Do you always push people away, or am I special?" The bluntness of it surprised him. He looked at her, really looked, and saw that she wasn't shaking anymore. The fear from earlier had burned off, leaving something sharper. Anger, maybe. Or just exhaustion with being treated like a problem. "I'm not pushing you away. I'm keeping my distance. There's a difference." "Is there?" "You're leaving in 3 days. I don't see the point in getting familiar." "Right." She picked up the empty cup. 3 days. "I'll try to remember that." She left without waiting for a response. The workshop felt colder after she was gone. That night, Ethan lay awake in his room and listened to the sounds of someone else in his house. Clara moving around the kitchen, the soft thump of her carpet bag being set down, the creak of the door to Sarah's sewing room. His chest went tight at that, but he didn't get up. Didn't go check if she'd noticed the shelf of half-finished baby clothes, the rocking chair Sarah had been so proud of finding at the mercantile. It was just 3 days. He could survive 3 days. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the gaps in the walls. The temperature dropped so fast he could feel it through the blankets. He got up, added wood to the fire in the main room, and noticed that Clara had done the same. The hearth was banked properly, enough to last through the night. She'd also washed the dishes, swept the floor, left the coffee tin where he could reach it easily. Small things, the kind of things Sarah used to do. He went back to bed and tried not to think about how empty the house had felt before today. Shuch, morning came too early and too bright. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, turning everything white and clean and lying. Ethan, dressed in the dark, moved quietly through the kitchen, built up the fire. He was boiling water for coffee when Clara's door opened. She looked worse than yesterday, her face pale, her eyes shadowed. She'd probably slept as badly as he had. "Morning," she said. "Morning. I was thinking about paying for the stagecoach fare. You said I'd need to work. Is there anyone in town who might hire me for 3 days?" He poured coffee, handed her a cup. "Not in 3 days. Maybe if you were staying longer." "I'm not." "Right. Well, then no. Most folks do their own work. We're not a big enough town to support much in the way of hired help." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Then I don't know what to do. You could wire someone, family back east, who could send money." "There's no one. I told you my aunt was all I had." "Friends?" "The kind who fade away when you don't have money anymore." She sat down at the small table, stared into the coffee. "I really did sell everything, spent it all to get here. I thought I was being brave, practical, making a new start. You were being those things. Someone just rigged the game. That's almost worse. If I'd just been stupid, I could learn from it. But someone deliberately—" She stopped, shook her head. "I keep trying to figure out who would do this, why they'd go to such trouble." "I've been thinking about that too." He sat across from her, cradling his own cup. "The letters knew things, personal things about me, about my wife. That means someone from town, someone close enough to know details. So ask them, ask everyone. Someone has to know something. Maybe. Or maybe whoever did it covered their tracks." He paused. "There's another option." "What?" "You stay longer than 3 days." Her head came up. "You said—" "I know what I said, but if you stay a few weeks, maybe a month, you could earn enough for the fare. Mrs. Henderson might take you on for sewing work, or the Reverend's wife might need help with, hell, I don't know, something." "A month?" She said it like she was testing the weight of the word. "Here, with you. In the spare room, same arrangement. You keep to yourself, I keep to myself, and when you've got the money, you leave." "Why would you do that?" Good question. He didn't have a good answer for this one either. "Because sending you back broke feels wrong, and because whoever wrote those letters is going to be watching, waiting to see what I do. I don't like being manipulated. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he'd lain awake last night listening to someone else breathing in his house, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence hadn't felt quite so much like drowning. But he wasn't ready to admit that, maybe not even to himself." Clara studied him over the rim of her cup. "What about the town? What are they going to say about an unmarried woman living in your house for a month? They're already talking. Might as well give them something to talk about." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." He stood, drained his coffee. "Think about it. Let me know." He left her there and went to the workshop, where the leather didn't ask questions and the work didn't require answers. But all morning he caught himself listening for sounds from the house, waiting to see what she'd decide. Around noon, she appeared in the doorway again. "1 month," she said. "Then I leave, whether I have the money or not. I'm not staying here indefinitely." "Agreed. And you talk to people. Try to figure out who sent those letters. I deserve to know." "I'll try." "And—" She hesitated. "I cook. It's one thing I'm actually good at. If I'm staying, I'm not eating stale bread for a month." "The kitchen's yours." "Fine." She turned to go, then stopped. "Thank you. For this. I know you don't want me here." "I don't want anyone here," he said. "It's not personal." "I know. That's what makes it sad." She left before he could respond. That night, the house smelled like stew, real stew, with meat and vegetables and something he couldn't identify but that made his mouth water. Clara had raided his meager supplies and somehow turned them into something that tasted like hope. He ate in silence while she cleaned up. Neither of them spoke. But when he went to bed that night, his stomach was full for the first time in months, and the house felt a little less like a tomb. 3 days, he'd said, then a month. He was already starting to wonder if a month would be enough. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, and in Salvation Creek, people were already whispering about the mail-order bride who'd stayed and the widower who'd let her. The story was just beginning, and neither of them had any idea how it would end. The first week passed in careful silence. Clara kept to her side of the house, Ethan to his. They circled each other like animals sharing a den out of necessity rather than choice, polite, distant, speaking only when required. She cooked. He ate. Cleaned. He worked. The arrangement felt temporary because it was supposed to be temporary, and both of them clung to that idea like a lifeline. But small things started changing anyway. On the third morning, Ethan came in from the workshop to find his good coat brushed clean and hanging by the door. He hadn't asked her to do it, hadn't even mentioned that the coat had been collecting dust since the last time he'd bothered going to town for anything other than supplies. He stood there for a moment, hand on the rough wool, feeling something uncomfortable twist in his chest. "The buttons were loose," Clara said from the kitchen. She didn't look up from the bread she was kneading. "I tightened them. They would have fallen off otherwise." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He waited for her to say more, but she just kept working the dough, her hands steady and practiced. After a moment, he took the coat and left. That afternoon, he came back with a length of blue fabric tucked under his arm. He set it on the kitchen table without comment and returned to the workshop before she could ask questions. But the next morning, he found biscuits with his coffee and a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you for the cloth. I'll make something practical." He crumpled the note and tossed it in the fire, but not before reading it twice. By the end of the first week, the house had developed a rhythm that neither of them acknowledged. Ethan rose before dawn, built up the fire, and had coffee ready by the time Clara emerged. She made breakfast while he worked. Nothing fancy, just eggs or porridge or whatever could be scraped together from his sparse supplies. They ate in silence. He went to the workshop. She cleaned, mended, found small tasks that kept her hands busy. In the evenings, she cooked while he finished whatever saddle or bridle he was working on. They ate together, still silent but no longer quite so stiff about it. Then she would sit by the fire with the mending while he read, old newspapers mostly, or the catalog from the mercantile that he'd already memorized. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't unbearable either. The town, meanwhile, had opinions. "Heard your house guest is still around," Tom Bradshaw said on Saturday morning when he came to check on his saddle. He had that tone people used when they wanted information but were pretending not to care. "She's staying a bit longer." Ethan didn't look up from his work. "How much longer?" "Until she's ready to leave." "People are talking, you know. Unmarried woman in your house. It doesn't look right." "Since when do you care what looks right? You owe money to half the men in this territory." Tom's face reddened. "That's different." "Is it?" "It's just, Sarah wouldn't have wanted—" Ethan's hands went still. He set down the awl very carefully and looked at Tom. "You want to finish that sentence?" Something in his voice must have gotten through because Tom took a step back. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "Then everyone can keep thinking it somewhere that isn't my workshop. Your saddle will be done Tuesday." Tom left, but others came with the same carefully worded concerns. Mrs. Henderson brought soup and questions about Clara's character. Reverend Matthews stopped by to discuss Christian propriety. Even Samuel Webb, who usually minded his own business, felt compelled to mention that appearances mattered in a small town. Ethan told them all the same thing. Clara was a guest. She'd be leaving soon. What happened under his roof was his concern, not theirs. But the questions bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not because he cared what the town thought. He'd stopped caring about that when they'd all shown up to Sarah's funeral with casseroles and pity. But because the questions forced him to examine something he'd been trying to ignore. Clara was becoming familiar. Not in the way Sarah had been familiar. That was different. Rooted in years and love and shared dreams. This was smaller, quieter. The way he'd started listening for her footsteps in the morning. The way he caught himself working faster so he could finish before dark. Could spend the evening in the warm kitchen instead of the cold workshop. The way his coffee tasted better when she made it. Small things, dangerous things. On Sunday, Clara asked if she could attend church. You don't need my permission, Ethan said. I need someone to walk with. I don't know the town well enough to go alone. I don't go to church. Because you don't believe, or because you're avoiding people? The question was direct enough to catch him off guard. Both. Well, I still want to go. I thought maybe it would help. With finding work. She was wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, careful not to look at him. People might be more willing to hire me if they see I'm respectable. They'll see you walk in with me and think the opposite of respectable. Let them think what they want. I need the work. He couldn't argue with that. So Sunday morning found him in his good coat, the one she'd mended, walking through the frozen streets with Clara beside him. She'd done something with her hair, pinned it up in a way that made her look older, more settled. The blue fabric he'd brought her had been turned into a proper dress, simple but well made. She looked like she belonged here, which was a lie, but a convincing one. The church was small and drafty, packed with people who all turned to stare when Ethan walked through the door. He hadn't been inside since the funeral, hadn't planned to come back. But Clara's hand was light on his arm, and she was walking forward with her chin up, so he followed. They sat in the back. The service was interminable, hymns and readings and a sermon about faith that Ethan stopped listening to after the first 5 minutes. But Clara paid attention, sang the hymns in a clear voice that didn't quite hit all the notes. When people turned to stare, she smiled politely and ignored the whispers. After the service, she worked the crowd like she'd been doing it her whole life. Introduced herself to Mrs. Henderson, complimented Elizabeth Matthews on her hat, asked Mary Bradshaw about her children. She was charming without being false, warm without being desperate. Within 20 minutes, she had 3 women discussing the possibility of sewing work and 1 invitation to help with the church's charity baskets. Ethan watched from the side and felt something uncomfortably close to admiration. "She's good with people," Samuel said, appearing at his elbow. "She's surviving." "Same thing out here." Samuel studied Clara, who was now listening intently to Mrs. Henderson describe some complicated alteration work. "You figure out who sent those letters yet?" "No." "Seems like you're not trying very hard." Ethan shot him a look. "You know something?" "Just that whoever did it knows you pretty well, knows what you'd respond to." Samuel paused. "Might want to think about that." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, Clara was back, her cheeks flushed from the cold and something like triumph. "Mrs. Henderson has 3 dresses that need hemming," she said as they walked home. "And Elizabeth Matthews wants help organizing the charity drive. It's not much, but it's something." "That's good." She also asked if I was planning to stay past the month. "What did you tell her?" "That I hadn't decided." Clara glanced at him. "Because I haven't. The agreement was 1 month." "I know what the agreement was." They'd reached the house. She stopped on the porch, turned to face him. "But things change. Maybe I could stay longer, if there's enough work, if—" "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. Clara flinched. "Why not?" "Because you're getting too comfortable here," he wanted to say. "Because I'm starting to expect you in the mornings. Because last night I almost told you about the time Sarah and I got lost in a snowstorm, and I haven't talked about her to anyone in 3 years. Because this isn't your home," he said instead. "You came here by mistake. Don't make another one by staying." Her face went carefully blank. "Right, of course." She pulled the shawl tighter. I'll be inside." She went in and closed the door. Ethan stood on the porch, breathing the cold air, telling himself he'd done the right thing. It didn't feel right. That week, the temperature dropped even further. The wind came howling down from the mountains, bringing snow that fell in sheets and didn't stop. Ethan woke Monday morning to find drifts against the doors and ice on the inside of the windows. The kind of cold that killed cattle and made people stupid. Clara was already up, feeding the fire in the kitchen. She'd wrapped herself in every layer she owned and was still shivering. "We need more wood," she said. "I checked the lean-to. There's maybe enough for 2 more days if we're careful." Ethan cursed under his breath. He'd meant to restock the woodpile last week but had put it off. Now they were going to pay for it. "I'll go out to the timber lot, cut what we need." "In this weather?" "We don't have a choice." "Then I'm coming with you." "Like hell you are." "You can't carry enough on your own, not in 1 trip, and you can't make 2 trips in this cold." She was already pulling on her boots. "I'm not going to freeze to death because you're too proud to accept help." They argued about it for another 5 minutes. But she was right, and they both knew it. So they bundled up in every warm thing they had and headed out into the storm. The timber lot was only half a mile from town, but it felt like 10. The wind cut through their clothes like knives, and the snow was so thick Ethan could barely see Clara walking beside him. He kept one hand on her arm, more to make sure she didn't get lost than to help her walk. The lot was deserted. No one else was foolish enough to be out in this. Ethan found the woodpile and started loading logs onto the sled he'd brought. Clara worked beside him, her hands clumsy with cold but determined. They didn't talk, couldn't, over the wind, just cut and loaded until the sled was piled high. The trip back was worse. The sled was heavy and kept catching on drifts. Twice Ethan had to stop and dig it out. Clara helped without being asked, her face red and her breath coming in gasps. They were halfway home when she stumbled. Ethan caught her before she went down, felt how badly she was shaking. "You all right?" "Just cold." "Can you make it?" "I don't have a choice, do I?" He almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, he shrugged out of his outer coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I'm bigger than you. I'll last longer. Keep moving." They made it back to the house more by determination than anything else. Ethan got the fire built up while Clara collapsed into a chair, still shaking. He heated water, made her drink something hot, piled blankets over her shoulders. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes, I did." Her teeth were chattering. "You would have tried to make 2 trips and ended up frozen in a drift somewhere." "I've survived worse." "That's not the same as being smart." He couldn't argue with that either. They spent the rest of the day thawing out. Clara dozed by the fire while Ethan worked on smaller projects, things he could do in the kitchen where it was warm. Every so often he'd glance over and find her watching him, her expression unreadable. That night she made soup from the last of the vegetables and some dried meat. It wasn't much, but it was hot and filling. They ate in the usual silence, but it felt different somehow, less careful. "Thank you," Clara said finally. "For the coat. Out there." "You thanked me already." "I'm thanking you again." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "It was practical. You freeze, I have to bury you. That's more work." "You're terrible at accepting kindness, you know that?" "I'm not accepting kindness. I'm stating facts." "Those can be the same thing." She set down her spoon. "Why do you do that? Push away anything that feels like connection?" "I'm not pushing away anything." "You are." "Constantly. Someone offers help, you refuse it. Someone shows care, you deflect it. Someone tries to get close, you remind them this is temporary." She leaned forward. "I get that you're grieving. I get that you lost people you loved. But you're still here, Ethan. You're still alive. At some point, you have to decide if you're going to keep living or just keep existing." The words hit harder than they should have. He set down his own spoon, felt anger rising, the clean, simple kind that was easier than everything else she was trying to make him feel. "You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know anything about me. I know you're lonely. I know you're hurting. I know you work yourself half to death so you don't have to think about it." "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" She stood up, started clearing the dishes with sharp, angry movements. "I lost everyone too, remember? My parents when I was 7. My aunt last year. I spent months alone in that house watching the mortgage come due, knowing I had no one and nothing. So I made a choice. I decided to try. To believe in something, even if it was just letters from a stranger. And look how that worked out. At least I tried." The dishes clattered in the basin. "At least I didn't just give up and decide the world owed me the right to be miserable forever." "You think I want this? You think I chose to—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You think I want to wake up every morning and remember they're gone? You think I want to live in this house full of things Sarah picked out, things she loved, knowing she'll never see them again? You think I want to be this?" The silence that followed was sharp and painful. "No," Clara said finally, quietly. "I don't think you want it. But I think you've decided it's what you deserve, and I think you're wrong." She left the dishes and went to her room. The door closed with a soft click that was somehow worse than slamming. Ethan sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the half-finished soup, feeling something crack open inside him that he'd worked 3 years to keep sealed. He didn't sleep that night, just lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about Sarah. They'd met at a barn dance, like he'd told Clara, but what he hadn't said was that Sarah had been the one to ask him to dance the second time, that she'd been the one to suggest they take a walk outside, away from the noise, that she'd been the one to kiss him first, standing in the moonlight with her hand on his cheek and her eyes full of certainty. "I know what I want," she'd said. "Do you?" And he had. Known it instantly, completely, with the kind of clarity that only comes once in a lifetime if you're lucky. They'd married 3 months later, built the house together, literally, Sarah insisting on helping even though she didn't know a hammer from a saw. She'd learned. She'd been good at that, at learning things, at adapting. Wyoming had been hard on her at first, but she'd found her place, made friends, started a garden, talked about the children they'd have, the life they'd build. When she'd gotten pregnant, Ethan had been terrified and thrilled in equal measure. He'd started making a cradle before she even started showing, had worked on it every night, getting the details perfect because his daughter deserved perfect. The cradle was still in the storage room, unfinished. He hadn't been able to make himself complete it. The labor had started early. Too early. The midwife had known right away something was wrong, but there was nothing to be done. Not out here, not with the nearest real doctor 2 days away. Sarah had labored for hours, getting weaker and weaker, and when the baby finally came, she wasn't breathing, and Sarah was bleeding, and Ethan had stood there useless, watching everything he loved slip away. Sarah had held on long enough to see the baby, long enough to name her Grace. Then she'd looked at Ethan with exhausted eyes and said, "Promise me you'll be all right." And he'd lied. Told her yes, he'd be all right, because what else could he say? She'd died believing it, and he'd spent 3 years proving himself a liar. Morning came gray and bitter. Ethan got up, built the fire, made coffee. When Clara emerged, her eyes were red, but her face was composed. "I'm sorry," she said. "For last night. I had no right. You were right." The words felt like glass in his throat. "About most of it." She stopped, studied him. "Ethan, I don't know how to do this. Any of this. I don't know how to let people in anymore. I don't know how to believe things can be good without waiting for them to go bad." He poured coffee with hands that wanted to shake. "Sarah asked me to be all right, and I can't even manage that." Clara moved closer, careful, like she was approaching something wounded. "Being all right doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean it stops hurting." "Then what does it mean?" "It means you keep going anyway. It means you let yourself have coffee with someone in the morning without feeling guilty about it. It means you don't have to carry everything alone." "I'm not good company." "I'm not asking you to be." She took the coffee he offered. "I'm just asking you to stop treating yourself like you're already dead." They stood in the kitchen as the winter light filtered through the windows, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Ethan let himself really look at her. Not as an inconvenience or a responsibility or a reminder of manipulation, just as Clara. A woman who'd lost everything and decided to keep trying anyway. Who'd crossed a continent on faith and faced a disappointment with her chin up. Who made good coffee and terrible jokes and somehow made his house feel less like a tomb. "1 month," he said. "What?" "You asked about staying longer. 1 more month after this one. That gives you time to earn the stagecoach fare and maybe save a little extra, if you want." Her face did something complicated. "Why?" "Because the sewing work is here. Because leaving in the middle of winter is stupid. Because—" He stopped, made himself finish. "Because I'm tired of eating stale bread and living in silence." A smile broke across her face, small but real. "Those are terrible reasons. They're the only ones I've got. Then I accept." They shook on it, formal and awkward, and Ethan felt something shift. Not healed. He wasn't naive enough to think healing worked that fast, but maybe starting to thaw, like the first crack in ice that's been frozen solid for too long. The rest of February passed in slow increments of change. Clara took on more work from the women in town, hemming and mending and alterations that kept her busy most days. She was good at it, fast and precise, and word spread. By the end of the month, she had more orders than she could handle alone. Ethan found excuses to stay in the house more often, brought his smaller projects inside where he could work at the kitchen table while Clara sewed. They didn't talk much at first, but gradually conversation started to happen. Small things, comments about the weather, observations about the town, stories that slipped out without planning. Clara told him about Boston, about growing up in her aunt's narrow house and learning to be quiet and useful. About her parents, who she barely remembered except in fragments. Her father's laugh, her mother's perfume. About the loneliness of watching everyone she knew build lives while she stayed frozen in place, caring for an aunt who grew more bitter with each passing year. Ethan found himself telling her things too, about learning saddle making from his father, who'd been a hard man but a good teacher, about the first time he'd worked leather that didn't fight back, how it had felt like magic, about Sarah, slowly at first, then more freely. The memories didn't hurt less exactly, but sharing them made them easier to carry. "She would have liked you," he said one evening. Clara looked up from the dress she was hemming. "You think so?" She liked people who weren't afraid to speak their minds. Said most folks wasted too much time saying what they thought others wanted to hear. "She sounds formidable." She was. He smiled, surprising himself. Stubborn as hell. Once she decided something, that was it, no arguing. "Where do you think she'd want you to be now?" The question was gentle, but it landed hard anyway. Ethan thought about it, really thought. "Not like this. She hated waste. Would have said I was wasting time being miserable when I could be doing something useful." "Then maybe you should listen to her." "Maybe." March arrived with false promises of spring. The snow started to melt, then froze again. Mud appeared in the streets, making everything messy and difficult. But the days were getting longer, and that meant something. It also meant Clara's 2 months were almost up. Neither of them mentioned it at first, but as the deadline approached, the house developed a tension that hadn't been there before. Clara grew quieter, spent more time in her room. Ethan found himself working later, putting off going inside. Finally, one evening at dinner, she brought it up. "The stagecoach runs again next week." "I know. I've saved almost enough for the fare. Mrs. Henderson is paying me for that batch of alterations tomorrow. That should cover it." "Good. That's good." They ate in silence for a while. "I could stay longer," Clara said finally. "If you wanted. There's more work available. I could—" "No." She set down her fork. "Why not?" "Because I'm getting used to you being here," he thought. "Because I listen for your footsteps. Because I made extra coffee this morning without thinking about it. Because last night I almost knocked on your door just to talk, and that terrified me. Because that wasn't the agreement," he said instead. "The agreement was 1 month. Then it became 2. Why can't it become 3? Because it has to end somewhere." "Does it?" She leaned forward. "Ethan, I'm happy here, happier than I've been in years. I have work, I have a place to stay, I have—" She stopped. "I have you, or something like that. And I think maybe you have me too, even if you won't admit it. You can't stay just because it's convenient. It's not about convenience, it's about—" She stood up, frustrated. "Why are you so determined to push me away?" "I'm not pushing. I'm being realistic. This was always temporary. Only because you decided it had to be." "What do you want from me?" The words came out louder than he intended. "You want me to ask you to stay, to build something here. I can't do that. I can't promise you anything." "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for a chance." "A chance at what?" "At this." She gestured between them. "At whatever this is. At not being alone. At—" She stopped, but he heard what she didn't say. "At love. At a future. At everything he'd sworn he'd never risk again." "I can't," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Clara's face crumpled, then hardened. "Fine. Then I'll leave next week, like planned." She left the table, left the dishes, left him sitting alone in the kitchen that had somehow become warm again and was about to go cold. Ethan sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of his own cowardice. The next few days were awful. Clara was polite but distant, speaking only when necessary. The easy rhythm they'd developed shattered back into careful formality. The house felt wrong, like something was broken that couldn't be fixed. Ethan threw himself into work, but it didn't help. Every saddle he finished just reminded him that he was finishing things, ending things, letting things go. On Thursday, Samuel stopped by, heard Clara's leaving soon. "News travels fast. It's a small town. We don't have much else to talk about." Samuel studied him. "You figure out who sent those letters?" "No." "That's because you stopped looking." Samuel sat on the workbench, uninvited. "You know what I think? I think you don't want to know." "That doesn't make sense." "Sure it does. Because if you found out who did it, you'd have to deal with why they did it, and I suspect the why would make you uncomfortable. Ethan set down his tools. You know something. I know you've been half dead for 3 years. I know this whole town has watched you turn into a ghost. I know some of us hoped you'd find your way back, but you seemed pretty committed to the grave. Samuel paused. Then Clara showed up. I didn't ask for her. No, but someone thought you needed her anyway. Someone who knew you well enough to know what might reach you. That's manipulative. It's also love, or something like it. Samuel stood. Point is, you've got a choice now. Let her go and go back to being dead. Or admit that maybe, just maybe, someone did you a favor. He left before Ethan could respond. That night, Ethan sat alone in the kitchen and thought about Sarah, about the promises he'd made and broken, about the life he'd stopped living because living hurt too much. Then he thought about Clara, about coffee in the mornings and arguments in the evenings, about the way she'd face down a Wyoming winter without flinching, about the sound of someone else breathing in the house, making it feel less like a tomb and more like a home. And he thought about the letters. He pulled them out, all of them, the ones Clara had brought, read through them again, looking for clues he'd missed. The handwriting was careful, feminine. The knowledge was intimate. The tone was hopeful. Someone who loved him, someone who knew Sarah. The realization hit like lightning. He was moving before he'd fully formed the thought, out the door and down the dark street toward the Henderson house. His knock was loud enough to wake the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson opened the door in her nightdress, startled. Ethan, what? You wrote them, he said. The letters. It was you. Her face told him everything, the guilt, the defiance, the fear. How did you? It had to be someone Sarah trusted, someone she'd talked to, someone who knew enough to make it convincing. He stepped closer. Why? Mrs. Henderson pulled her shawl tighter. Because Sarah asked me to. The world tilted. What? When she was dying, she knew. She knew you'd blame yourself. She knew you'd stop living. So she made me promise. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. She said if enough time passed and you were still alone, I should help. Find someone good, someone strong enough to handle you. So you invented letters? Tricked some woman into crossing the country? I didn't trick anyone. I placed an advertisement, same as any matchmaker would. Clara responded. I read her letters, and I knew. I knew she was what Sarah would have wanted for you. Someone kind but not soft. Someone who'd lost enough to understand but hadn't let it break her. You had no right. Sarah gave me the right, Mrs. Henderson's voice broke. She spent her last hours worrying about you instead of herself. The least I could do was try to honor that, even if it meant you'd hate me for it. Ethan stood there, breathing hard, feeling 3 years of carefully constructed walls crumbling around him. Did Clara know about any of this? No, she believed every word. That's what made it work. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes. I'm sorry I lied, but I'm not sorry I tried. You needed someone, Ethan. You still do. He left without responding, walked back through the dark streets in a daze. Sarah had planned this. Not the details, maybe, but the intention. She'd loved him enough to try to save him from himself even after she was gone, and he was about to let it fail. Clara was packing when he got back. He could hear her moving around in her room, the soft sounds of belongings being folded and put away. He stood outside her door for a long moment before knocking. Come in. She was dressed for travel, her carpet bag open on the bed. The blue dress she'd made was folded on top. She didn't look at him. I talked to Mrs. Henderson, he said. That got her attention. And? She wrote the letters. She's the one who sent for you. Clara went very still. Why? Because Sarah asked her to before she died. She was worried about me. Wanted someone to make sure I didn't... He stopped, made himself finish. That I didn't stay alone forever. Oh. Clara sat down on the bed, looking stunned. That's... I don't know what that is. It's manipulative. It's presumptuous. It's... He moved into the room, closer to her. It's maybe the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me. Ethan, don't leave. The words hung in the air between them. What? Don't get on that stagecoach. Don't go back east. Don't... He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated with how inadequate words were. I know I know I pushed you away. I know I made this harder than it had to be. But Clara, you asked me what I wanted, and I'm telling you now. I want you to stay. For how long? I don't know. Longer than 2 months. Longer than I can see from here. He knelt down so they were eye level. I can't promise it'll be easy. I can't promise I won't mess this up. But I can promise I'll try. Really try. Her eyes were shining. Try at what? At living again. At letting someone in. He reached for her hand, felt how it trembled in his. At loving you, if you'll let me. The silence stretched out, painful and full of possibility. Then Clara smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest winter. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. He kissed her then, clumsy and uncertain, like someone who'd forgotten how. But she kissed him back, and that was enough. That was everything. The morning after felt strange in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. He woke to sunlight streaming through a window he'd kept shuttered for years, and for a moment, he forgot why he'd opened it. Then he heard Clara humming in the kitchen, and it all came rushing back. The kiss, the confession, the choice he'd made to stop running from something that felt dangerously close to happiness. He got up, dressed slowly, trying to figure out how you were supposed to act when you just asked someone to build a life with you. Sarah had made it look easy, but Sarah had been good at things like that. Ethan was better with leather than people. When he came into the kitchen, Clara was making coffee. She'd braided her hair, and there was flour on her sleeve. She looked up when he entered, and for a second they just stood there, both of them clearly wondering what happened next. "Morning," she said finally. "Morning. I made extra biscuits. I thought maybe you'd be hungry." "I'm always hungry." She smiled at that, some of the tension easing. They sat down together, and the silence that followed wasn't quite comfortable yet, but wasn't unbearable either. Ethan ate 3 biscuits before realizing he'd been so focused on not looking awkward that he'd forgotten to taste them. "So," Clara said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "What now?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, we decided I'm staying. You said you'd try, but we didn't exactly discuss the details." She met his eyes. What are we, exactly?" It was a fair question. Ethan wished he had a better answer. "I don't know. I haven't done this in a long time." "Done what? Courted someone?" "Done any of it. Sarah and we knew from the start what we were building toward. This is different. Because I'm not Sarah." The words hung there, sharp-edged. Ethan looked at her, saw the uncertainty beneath the directness. "No. You're not Sarah, and I'm not asking you to be, but I'm also not the same person I was when I met her. I don't know what I can give you, Clara. I just know I don't want you to leave." She considered that for a long moment. "Then we figure it out as we go. No promises about what this becomes. Just, we try. We're honest. We don't pretend it's something it's not." "I can do that." "Good." She stood, started clearing the dishes. "Because I should probably tell you that half the town watched you run to Mrs. Henderson's house last night, and by now they've invented at least 6 different stories about what happened." Ethan groaned. "Of course they have. So we're going to need to give them something, a story that's close enough to the truth that they'll stop making up their own versions." "What do you suggest?" "The truth." She glanced at him. "That Mrs. Henderson made a mistake that turned into something good. That we're seeing where this goes, that it's nobody's business but ours." "You think they'll accept that?" "No, but at least we'll have said it." She was right, of course. The town was waiting for an explanation, and the longer they waited to provide one, the wilder the speculation would get. So that afternoon they walked into the mercantile together, and when Mrs. Henderson saw them, her face went white. "Ethan, it's all right," he said, and meant it. "What you did it wasn't your place, but I understand why you did it." Relief flooded her features. "I was only trying to help." "I know." He looked at Clara, who nodded encouragement. "And it worked. Maybe not the way you planned, but it worked anyway." Word spread like fire in dry grass. By evening, everyone knew that Clara was staying, that she and Ethan were courting, or something like it. and that Mrs. Henderson had orchestrated the whole thing with the best intentions. The reactions were mixed. Some people thought it was romantic, others thought it was scandalous. Most just seemed relieved that the story finally had a shape they could understand. But understanding a story and living it were two different things. The first real test came 3 days later when Ethan woke to Clara standing in the doorway of his room, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. "I can't breathe," she said. He was on his feet before he'd fully processed the words, crossing the small space between them. "What's wrong? Are you sick?" "No, I just—" She pressed a hand to her chest. "I woke up and I couldn't— Everything felt wrong. Too small, too close. I thought maybe if I got up, walked around, but it's not helping." Her breathing was too fast, shallow. Ethan had seen this before. Panic, the kind that grabbed you for no reason and wouldn't let go. Sarah used to get it sometimes, especially in the early days when Wyoming had felt more like exile than adventure. "Come here." He guided her to the chair by the fire, which was down to embers. "Sit. Look at me." Clara sat, her hands gripping the armrest hard enough to hurt. "I'm sorry, I don't know why—" "Don't apologize, just look at me, right here." He knelt in front of her, took her hands in his. They were freezing. "You're safe. You're in the house. Nothing's wrong. I know that, but my chest—" "I know, it feels like you're dying. You're not. It just feels that way." He kept his voice steady, calm. "Breathe with me. In through your nose, slow. Hold it. Out through your mouth." She tried, failed, tried again. It took several minutes before her breathing started to even out, before the color came back to her face. When it did, she slumped forward, exhausted. "What was that?" "Fear, mostly. It happens sometimes when you've been holding yourself together too tight for too long." He stood, built up the fire. "You've been here 2 months, trying to prove you can handle this place, trying not to be a burden. Eventually, that catches up with you." "How did you know?" Sarah used to get them. She'd wake up convinced something terrible was about to happen, that she'd made a mistake coming here, that she was trapped. He sat across from her. Took her a year to stop having them regularly. Clara looked at him, understanding dawning. "And you? Do you get them?" "Not the same way. Mine come when I'm awake. Usually when I'm working and I look up and remember all over again that she's not coming through that door." He paused. "They've been better lately, since you've been here. So we're both a mess." "Seems like." She laughed, shaky but real. "That's not very romantic." "No, but it's honest." They sat in the growing firelight, not touching but close, and Ethan thought maybe this was what trying looked like. Not perfect moments or grand gestures, but showing up when someone couldn't breathe and helping them remember how. Spring arrived in fits and starts, never quite committing. The snow would melt for a few days, revealing mud and dead grass and the wreckage of winter, then freeze again overnight. The wind kept blowing, but it smelled different now, like thaw and possibility instead of just cold. Clara's sewing business grew. Women from neighboring ranches started bringing work, sometimes writing hours just to have her do alterations or make new dresses from old fabric. She was good at it, better than good, and word spread. By April, she was making enough to contribute to the household expenses, which she insisted on doing despite Ethan's protests. "I'm not living here on charity," she said one evening, counting out coins at the kitchen table. "You're not living here on charity. You're living here because I asked you to. And I'm paying my way because I have pride." She pushed half the coins toward him. "For food and firewood. Don't argue." He argued anyway, but she won. She usually did when she'd made up her mind about something. They settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Ethan worked in the shop during the day while Clara sewed. In the evenings, they'd cook together, or rather, she'd cook while he chopped vegetables and tried not to get in the way. After dinner, they'd sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in the same space. It wasn't romance the way the novels described it, but it was something solid, and that mattered more. The first time Ethan took her hand, it was by accident. They were walking back from the mercantile, and she slipped on a patch of ice. He caught her, steadied her, and somehow his hand ended up in hers. He started to pull away, then didn't. Her fingers were cold, small against his calloused palm. She didn't let go either. They walked the rest of the way like that, not talking about it, both pretending it was practical rather than something else entirely. The first time he kissed her, really kissed her, not the desperate, clumsy thing in her room that night, was in the workshop. She'd brought him coffee and stayed to watch him work, asking questions about the leather, the tools, the process. He'd been explaining how you had to read the grain, follow the natural pattern of the hide, when he'd looked up and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "What?" he'd asked. "Nothing. It's just, you love this, the work. I can see it in your face. It's what I'm good at. No, it's more than that. It's..." She'd stepped closer. "It's the only time you don't look like you're carrying the weight of the world." He'd kissed her then, leather dust on his hands and her hair smelling like the soap she made from lye and lavender. It was better than the first time. Less desperate, more deliberate. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. "That was nicer," she said. "Than what?" "Than the last one. Less like you were drowning and more like you meant it." "I meant that one too." "I know. But this one was better." She was right. It had been. But spring also brought challenges they hadn't anticipated. With the thaw came travelers, people passing through Salvation Creek on their way to somewhere else. And some of them noticed Clara, noticed that she was young and pretty and living in a house with a man she wasn't married to. The first real confrontation came on a Saturday in late April. Ethan was in town picking up supplies when he heard raised voices outside the mercantile. He came out to find a stranger. Big man, rough clothes, traveler's pack, standing too close to Clara. "I'm just saying, a woman alone like you could do better than a broken-down widower." "I'm not alone," Claire said, her voice tight. "And I'm not interested." "You say that now, but..." She said she's not interested. Ethan set down the supplies, positioned himself between Clara and the stranger. "You should move along." The man looked him up and down, clearly deciding whether it was worth the fight. He was bigger than Ethan, younger, probably tougher, but something in Ethan's face must have convinced him otherwise because he backed off, hands raised. "Didn't mean any harm, just making conversation." "Make it somewhere else." The man left. Clara was shaking, but from anger rather than fear. "I had it handled," she said. "I know." "Then why did you..." "Because I wanted to." He picked up the supplies. "Because the idea of someone talking to you like that made me want to break his jaw. And because I'm allowed to want to protect you even if you don't need protecting." She was quiet on the walk home. When they reached the house, she stopped him before he could go inside. "That's going to keep happening, you know. As long as I'm living here unmarried, people are going to make assumptions. Say things. Let them." "It doesn't bother you?" "What bothers me is the idea that we have to do something just because people expect it. We said we'd figure this out as we go. That means we do it on our timeline, not theirs. And if the timeline never gets to marriage? If we just stay like this?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been avoiding thinking too far ahead, taking it day by day because that felt safer. But now she was asking him to look at the future, and he realized he could actually see one. Not clearly, not in perfect detail, but the shape of it was there. "Then we stay like this," he said. "If that's what works." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Something was shifting inside him, had been shifting for weeks. The idea of Clara leaving didn't just make him uncomfortable anymore. It made him panicked. The idea of her with someone else made him angry in ways he didn't fully understand. And the idea of her staying, of building something permanent, didn't terrify him the way it should have. That night, he lay awake and thought about Sarah. Not with the crushing grief that had defined the last 3 years, but with something gentler. Gratitude, maybe, for the time they'd had. Sorrow for what had been lost. And underneath it all, permission. He couldn't say where it came from, whether he was imagining it or whether some part of Sarah's love had survived death to tell him it was all right to move forward. But he felt it anyway. The next morning, he woke with a decision already made. He got up early before Clara was awake and went to the storage room. The room he hadn't opened in 3 years. The room full of Sarah's things and the life they'd planned and the future that had died. His hand shook when he turned the knob. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Sarah's sewing supplies on the table, the rocking chair in the corner, the shelf of baby clothes she'd made, tiny and perfect and useless. And in the back, covered with a sheet, the cradle he'd never finished. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time, feeling the weight of it all. Then he started moving, carefully, Respectfully, he began sorting through Sarah's things. The clothes that could be donated, the sewing supplies that Clara might use, the personal items, letters, a journal, the locket her mother had given her, that he'd keep because they were Sarah's and they mattered. The baby clothes he wrapped in paper and put in a box. Maybe someday he'd be able to look at them without his chest caving in. Today wasn't that day, but that was all right. The cradle he uncovered, studied. It was good work, even unfinished. He could complete it. Not for the baby who'd never used it, but as a way of honoring what it had been meant to be. He was standing there, running his hand over the smooth wood, when Clara found him. "Ethan?" Her voice was soft, careful. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning out the room." He didn't turn around. "Thought maybe you could use it. For your sewing. The light's better in here than the kitchen." He heard her step inside, felt her presence beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't push, just stood there. "You don't have to do this for me," she said finally. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me." He looked at her then. "I've been holding on to this room like it was a shrine. Like if I kept everything exactly the same, I could keep Sarah alive somehow. But she's not here. And keeping this room closed isn't honoring her. It's just me being afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of forgetting. Of moving on and losing even the memory of her." He touched the cradle again. "But I'm starting to realize that's not how it works. Memory isn't something you have to protect by keeping everything frozen. It's something you carry with you while you keep living." Claire's eyes were bright. "She'd be proud of you. For this. Maybe. Or maybe she'd tell me I was being dramatic and should have done it 3 years ago." He smiled despite himself. "She wasn't much for wallowing. Neither am I." Clara looked around the room. "If you're serious about this, about me using this space, I'd like to keep some of her things. The sewing basket, maybe, and that sampler on the wall. They'd be good to have around." "You don't mind?" "Why would I mind? She was your wife. She's part of your story. I'm not trying to erase that." She met his eyes. "I'm just trying to add to it." They spent the rest of the morning cleaning out the room together. It should have been sad, and in some ways it was. But it also felt right, like opening windows in a house that had been closed too long, letting air and light back in. By afternoon, the room was transformed. Clara's sewing supplies on the table, Sarah's basket beside them. The curtains opened, the floor swept, the space feeling lived in again. The only thing left was the cradle, which Ethan moved to the workshop. That evening he started working on it. Not frantically, the way he'd worked when Sarah was pregnant, trying to finish before the baby came, but steadily, carefully, taking his time to get it right. Clara sat with him while he worked, mending clothes in the lamplight, and it felt like something settling into place. "What will you do with it when it's finished?" she asked. "I don't know yet. Give it to someone who needs it, maybe." "That would be good. Better than it sitting unused." He nodded, focused on the joint he was fitting. Then, because the question had been sitting in his chest for weeks, and he was tired of carrying it alone, "Do you want children, someday?" Her hand stilled on the fabric. I hadn't really thought about it. After my aunt died, I was so focused on surviving that I didn't let myself think about things like that. And now? Now I'm still mostly focused on surviving, but yes, someday, if things worked out that way." She looked at him. "Do you? Want more children, I mean?" The question hit harder than he expected. He told himself for 3 years that he'd never risk it again, never put himself through the terror of loving something that fragile. But sitting here with Clara, watching her hands work the needle with the same competence Sarah's hands had once shown, he realized the answer had changed. "I think so," he said. "Someday, if things worked out." They left it at that, but the conversation stayed with Ethan long after they'd gone to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about futures he'd stopped letting himself imagine, about a house that wasn't silent, about children who might have Clara's eyes and his hands and Sarah's stubborn streak, because genetics were strange that way and love didn't follow logical patterns. He thought about asking Clara to marry him. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt inevitable, like something that had been building since the moment she'd stepped off that stagecoach and refused to freeze to death just because he was too broken to help her. But there was still the question of how. Sarah had made it easy. She'd known what she wanted and hadn't been shy about saying so. Clara was different. She'd come here expecting a husband and gotten something messier, more uncertain. She deserved better than a half-hearted proposal from a man who was still figuring out how to feel things again. So he waited, kept working on the cradle, kept making coffee in the mornings and sitting with her in the evenings, kept learning how to be someone who could offer more than just survival. May brought the first real warmth. Wildflowers started blooming on the hillsides, painting the brown landscape with impossible colors. The creek that gave the town its name swelled with snowmelt, running fast and clear. People started talking about planting, about the summer ahead, about futures instead of just getting through the day. Claire's birthday fell on the 15th. She mentioned it casually one morning, then seemed surprised when Ethan remembered. "You don't have to make a fuss," she said. "I'm not making a fuss. I'm acknowledging that you were born, and I'm glad you were." That's almost romantic. Almost? You could work on the delivery. He did make a fuss, though he'd have died before admitting it. Asked Mrs. Henderson what kind of cake Clara might like. Bought fabric he couldn't afford from a traveling merchant. Spent 3 evenings working on something he'd never attempted before. A small wooden box with a fitted lid and a brass hinge he'd traded a bridle for. On the morning of her birthday, he left the box on the kitchen table before she woke up. Inside was the fabric, folded carefully, and a note in his terrible handwriting. For making something beautiful. Happy birthday. He was in the workshop when she found it, too nervous to watch her reaction. But she came out an hour later with red eyes and the box clutched to her chest. "This is the nicest thing anyone's ever given me," she said. "It's just a box." "It's not just a box, it's—" She set it down, crossed to him, and kissed him hard enough to make him forget what he'd been working on. When she pulled back, she was smiling through tears. "Thank you." That night, half the town showed up for a birthday supper that Elizabeth Matthews had organized. Clara looked overwhelmed and happy in equal measure, and Ethan stood in the corner watching her laugh with the other women and felt something in his chest unknot. She fit here, not because she'd changed to match the place, but because she'd found a way to be herself within it, and watching her, Ethan realized he'd been doing the same thing. Slowly, without noticing, he'd started fitting back into his own life. Later, after everyone had left and they were cleaning up, Clara leaned against the counter and looked at him. "This was a good day," she said. "Yeah, I'm glad I'm here. Glad I got on that stagecoach. Glad Mrs. Henderson wrote those letters. Glad for all of it, even the parts that were hard." "Me too." "Ethan?" She was fiddling with the edge of her apron, nervous about something. "What are we doing?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're courting, I suppose. But we haven't talked about what comes after courting, if anything comes after. And I'm not trying to push you, but I think we need to be honest about where this is going, whether it's going anywhere at all or if we're just existing together until one of us decides we're done." He set down the dish he'd been drying. "What do you want it to be?" "I asked you first." "Clara, no, I need to know, because I'm—" She stopped, gathered herself. "I'm in love with you. I know that's probably not what you want to hear, and I know it's complicated, but it's true. And I need to know if there's any possibility you might feel the same way, or if I should start preparing myself for this to end." The words hung in the air between them, honest and terrifying and impossibly brave. Ethan thought about all the ways he could answer, all the careful, measured responses that would protect him from risk, all the ways he could keep one foot out the door in case everything went wrong again. Then he thought about Sarah, about the promises she'd made Mrs. Henderson make, about how she'd loved him enough to want him to be happy even after she was gone. "I love you too," he said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And it terrifies me because the last time I loved someone this much, I lost her. But I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of living like I'm already dead." Clara was crying now, but smiling through it. "So what do we do? We get married, if you want to." He crossed to her, took her hands. "I don't have a ring yet. I don't have a speech prepared. But I know I want to wake up with you every morning for the rest of my life. I know I want to build something real with you. And I know that Sarah would have liked you, and she'd be glad I found you, or that you found me. Is that a proposal?" "It's the best I've got." "Then yes." She kissed him, soft and certain. Yes to all of it. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church with the whole town watching. Clara wore a dress she'd made from the fabric Ethan had given her, and he wore his good suit that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest it had been stored in. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, and Mrs. Henderson cried through the whole thing. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected, there was a long silence. Then Tom Bradshaw, drunk already, called out, "About time!" and everyone laughed. Ethan kissed his wife, and felt something slot into place that had been broken for so long he'd forgotten what whole felt like. The reception was loud and chaotic, and exactly what a wedding should be. People ate too much and drank more than that, and told stories about both of them that were only partially true. Someone produced a fiddle, and Clara made Ethan dance even though he protested that he didn't know how. "Neither do I," she said, laughing as he stepped on her foot. "We'll figure it out together." And they did. Stumbling and graceless but together, which was what mattered. Later, much later, when everyone had finally left and they were alone in the house that was now officially theirs, Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked around. "It feels different," she said. "The same, but different." "How?" "Like it's ours now. Not just yours that I'm borrowing, ours." Ethan pulled her close, felt her settle against him like she'd always been meant to fit there. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold and full of stars. Inside, the fire burned warm, and for the first time in 3 years, the house felt like a home. "Yeah," he said, "ours." Marriage, Ethan discovered, was nothing like he remembered, and everything he'd forgotten he needed. With Sarah, it had been building something from nothing, two young people figuring out life together. With Clara, it was rebuilding, messier, harder, weighted with the knowledge that everything good could be taken away without warning. The first month was strange. They'd been living together for weeks already, but being married changed things in ways neither of them had anticipated. Small things, mostly. The way Clara now left her hairbrush on his dresser without asking. The way Ethan found himself saying "we" instead of "I" when talking about plans. The way they'd both stop sometimes, in the middle of ordinary moments, and remember that this was permanent now. That they'd chosen each other in front of witnesses and couldn't take it back even if they wanted to. Not that either of them wanted to, but the weight of permanence took getting used to. The first real fight happened on a Saturday in June. Clara had been working on a complicated dress order, and the client had changed her mind 3 times about the design. By the time Ethan came in for supper, Clara was sitting at her sewing table with her head in her hands, surrounded by scraps of fabric and muttering something that sounded like cursing. "Bad day?" he asked. "Mrs. Carmichael wants lace now." "Lace?" "After I've already finished the bodice twice, and she wants it by Monday because apparently her daughter's betrothal party can't possibly wait another week." Clara looked up, her eyes tired. "I'm going to have to work through the night. Maybe tomorrow, too." "Tell her no." "I can't tell her no. She's paying good money. She's taking advantage. There's a difference between paying for work and expecting you to kill yourself over a dress. I'm not killing myself. I'm doing my job." "Your job doesn't include letting people walk all over you." Clara's jaw tightened. "I know how to manage my own business. Thank you." "I didn't say you didn't. I'm just saying, you're saying I should turn away paying customers because the work is hard? That's easy for you to say. You've been established here for years. People respect your work. I'm still proving myself." "You've already proven yourself. Every woman in town comes to you now. You don't need to accept unreasonable demands." "And you get to decide what's unreasonable?" She stood up, facing him across the cluttered table. "You get to tell me how to run my business, how much work is too much, what I should and shouldn't accept?" "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm trying to—" He stopped, frustrated. "I'm trying to keep you from working yourself into the ground for someone who doesn't appreciate it." "Well, I didn't ask you to. I can take care of myself. I've been doing it my whole life." The words stung more than they should have. Ethan felt his own temper rising, that old familiar anger that he'd thought he'd left behind. "Fine, work yourself to death. See if I care." He walked out before she could respond, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. He made it halfway to the workshop before the anger burned itself out, leaving only shame in its wake. He'd done exactly what he'd sworn he wouldn't do, let his fear turn into control, his care into criticism. He stood there in the cooling evening air, hands clenched, trying to figure out how you apologized for being an idiot. When he came back inside an hour later, Clara was still at her sewing table. She didn't look up when he entered. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For telling you how to do your job, for acting like you can't make your own decisions, for... He moved closer, for being scared and letting it come out wrong. That got her attention. She set down the needle. Scared of what? Of you working too hard, getting sick, breaking down the way you did that morning. I know it's not rational, but when I see you pushing yourself like this, all I can think about is... He stopped, made himself finish. Sarah used to work too hard, insisted she was fine when she wasn't, and by the time I realized something was wrong, it was too late to fix it. Clara's face softened. I'm not Sarah. I know that, but I can't help being afraid anyway. She stood, came around the table to him. I appreciate that you worry, but Ethan, I need you to trust me to know my own limits. And when I do push too hard, I need you to tell me without making it sound like I'm being stupid. You're right. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry for snapping. I'm tired and frustrated, and I took it out on you. She leaned against him. We're both still learning this, aren't we? How to be married to each other. Yeah. He wrapped his arms around her. Think we'll ever figure it out? Maybe. Or maybe we'll just keep stumbling through and calling it progress. They finished the dress together that night. Ethan didn't know anything about sewing, but he could hold things steady while Clara pinned, could fetch supplies, could make coffee at midnight when they were both exhausted but determined to finish. When they finally completed the last stitch at 3 a.m, Clara looked at it with satisfaction. It's good work, she said. It's better than good. It's exceptional, which is why you should charge her extra for the changes. Clara laughed. I'll think about it. She did charge extra, and Mrs. Carmichael paid without complaint. After that, Clara started being more selective about which jobs she took and what she was willing to tolerate. And Ethan learned to express concern without trying to make decisions for her. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Summer came in full force, bringing heat that felt impossible after the brutal winter. The town expanded as travelers and new settlers arrived, drawn by rumors of good land and opportunity. Some stayed. Most passed through. All of them changed Salvation Creek in small ways, adding new buildings, new businesses, new stories to the collective history. Ethan's work picked up too. With more people came more horses, and with more horses came more need for quality tack. He hired an apprentice, a quiet kid named James who'd lost his father to cholera and needed something to do with his hands. Teaching someone else the craft forced Ethan to articulate things he'd only ever understood instinctively, and he found he liked it. Clara watched him with James one afternoon, saw how patient he was with the boy's mistakes, how clearly he explained each step. You're good with him, she said later. He's a fast learner. No, I mean, you're good at teaching, good with young people. She paused. You'd be a good father. The comment landed softly, but stayed. They hadn't talked about children since that night in the workshop, but the subject hung between them, unspoken but present. Clara had turned 26 in May. Ethan was 33. If they were going to have children, they needed to start thinking about it seriously. But the fear was still there. Every time Ethan let himself imagine Clara pregnant, his mind went immediately to Sarah, to blood and screaming and the midwife's apologetic eyes. He couldn't shake the certainty that loving something that much meant losing it. He knew it was irrational, knew that plenty of women survived childbirth, that Sarah's death had been tragic but not inevitable. But knowing something and believing it were different things. Clara brought it up officially on a night in late July. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, when she said, I want to talk about children. Ethan's stomach clenched. All right. I know you're scared. I know what happened with Sarah makes this harder. But Ethan, I want to be a mother. And I think you want to be a father again, even if you're afraid to admit it. I do want it, but I also... He struggled for words. I don't know if I can go through it again. Watching someone I love in that much pain, risking losing both of you. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are. But that's not really the point. She took his hand. The point is that we can't live our whole lives avoiding risk. Bad things happen. People die. But good things happen too. And we don't get to have the good without accepting that the bad is possible. What if I lose you? What if you don't? What if everything goes fine and we end up with a healthy baby and a life we built together? She squeezed his hand. I'm not saying we have to decide tonight, But I'm saying we need to actually talk about it instead of just being quietly terrified. So they talked, not just that night, but over weeks. Honest conversations about fear and hope and what they wanted their future to look like. Clara shared her own fears, that she might not be able to get pregnant, that she might be a terrible mother, that childbirth might be as bad as everyone said it was. Ethan admitted that his fear wasn't just about losing her, but about failing again, about not being enough to keep the people he loved safe. You can't keep everyone safe, Clara said gently. That's not how life works. But you can love them, and you can show up, and you can do your best. That's all anyone can do. By August, they'd made a decision, or rather they'd stopped actively preventing one. Clara threw away the herbs she'd been using, and they both held their breath and waited. Nothing happened immediately, which was both a relief and a disappointment. Life continued normally, work and meals and small pleasures that added up to something like happiness. Ethan finished the cradle and gave it to a young couple expecting their first child. Clara expanded her sewing business, taking on a girl named Annie as an assistant. The house they'd built together felt more solid with each passing day. September brought the first hints of autumn. The leaves started turning, and the air got that crisp quality that meant winter was coming again. Clara's monthly cycle came and went twice more, and each time Ethan saw the disappointment in her face, even though she tried to hide it. Maybe it's not meant to happen, she said one night. Or maybe it just takes time. I'm not getting any younger. You're 26, not 60. We've got time. But privately, he wondered if maybe his fear had somehow prevented it. If his body knew what his mind was thinking and had decided not to risk it. Then October came, and Clara missed her cycle. She didn't tell him at first. He noticed she was quieter than usual, more careful about what she ate, but he didn't want to ask in case he was wrong. Finally, 2 weeks later, she came to him in the workshop with a strange expression on her face. I think I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Ethan set down the leather he'd been working on very carefully. You're sure? Not completely, but all the signs are there. I feel different, and it's been almost 6 weeks since... She stopped. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. Ethan crossed to her, put his hands on her shoulders. Up close, he could see the mix of joy and terror in her eyes, and he knew his face probably showed the same thing. How do you feel about it? He asked. Terrified, excited, sick to my stomach most mornings. She managed to smile. All of it at once. Yeah, me too. They held each other in the workshop while the autumn light filtered through the windows, and Ethan felt the future shifting again, becoming something bigger than just the two of them. The pregnancy was confirmed a week later by the midwife, a stern woman named Ruth, who delivered half the babies in Salvation Creek. She examined Clara, asked a dozen intrusive questions, then pronounced her about 8 weeks along and healthy. First baby? She asked. Yes, Clara said. Ruth looked at Ethan. Your first was difficult. It wasn't a question. Everyone in town knew what had happened to Sarah. Yes. Well, every pregnancy is different. No reason to think this one will be the same. Ruth packed up her supplies. That said, she's small, needs to eat more. And you, she pointed at Ethan, need to stop looking like someone's about to die. Fear doesn't help anyone. After she left, Clara and Ethan sat in silence for a long moment. She's pleasant, Clara said finally. She's good at her job. That's what matters. Are you all right? Really? Ethan thought about lying, then remembered they'd promised to be honest. I'm scared, but I want this. I want to meet this person we made. I want to see you be a mother. I just also want you to survive it. That's the plan. She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. We're going to be fine, all three of us. He wanted to believe her, tried to let the certainty in her voice override the fear in his head. Mostly failed, but kept trying anyway. The next few months were strange. Claire's body changed in ways that were both familiar and completely new. She got sick in the mornings, exhausted in the afternoons, ravenous at strange hours. Her temper got sharper, her emotions more volatile. One minute she'd be crying over a broken dish, the next laughing at something that wasn't particularly funny. Ethan tried to be patient, tried to remember that her body was doing something extraordinary and difficult. Mostly succeeded, sometimes failed and had to apologize later. The town rallied around them in ways that surprised him. Women who'd barely spoken to Clara before started bringing food, offering advice, sharing their own pregnancy stories. Mrs. Henderson knitted tiny clothes. Elizabeth Matthews organized a quilting circle that produced a beautiful blanket. Even Tom Bradshaw, drunk as usual, clapped Ethan on the back and told him he'd be a good father. "How do you know?" Ethan asked. "Because you give a damn. That's half the battle right there." As winter approached again, Clara got bigger. By December, she was visibly pregnant, her belly round and pronounced under her dresses. She'd stopped doing intricate sewing work, her fingers too swollen to manage the fine detail, but she still did alterations and taught Annie how to handle the more complicated orders. Ethan watched her constantly, looking for signs of distress, comparing every symptom to what he remembered of Sarah's pregnancy. Ruth caught him at it one day when she came for a checkup. "She's not your first wife," Ruth said bluntly. "I know that." "Do you?" "Because you're treating her like she's made of glass. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Most of them survive it." "Most isn't all." "No, but living in fear of the worst outcome doesn't prevent it. It just makes everyone miserable in the meantime." Ruth softened slightly. "I know what you lost, but you can't let it poison what you have now." She was right, and Ethan knew it, but knowing and doing were different things. Christmas came, and with it the anniversary of when Clara had first arrived. They spent it quietly at home, just the two of them, remembering how far they'd come. Clara was 7 months pregnant now, moving slowly, her back aching constantly. But she was healthy. Ruth checked her every week and kept saying everything was progressing normally. "Do you ever think about those letters?" Clara asked on Christmas night, "about how Mrs. Henderson set all this up?" "Sometimes." "Do you think Sarah would approve? Of us, I mean. Of this baby?" Ethan thought about it, really thought. "Yeah, I think she would. I think she'd be glad I found you, glad we found each other. I wish I could have met her. She'd have liked you, probably would have tried to give you advice about handling me." Clara laughed. "I could use it. You're not the easiest man to live with." "Neither are you. Easiest woman, I mean." "Good. Easy is boring." They sat by the fire, Clara's head on his shoulder, his hand on her belly where their child moved and kicked and prepared to enter a world that was harsh and beautiful and full of possibility. January brought bitter cold and the growing awareness that the baby would be here soon. Clara's movements got more restricted, her discomfort more pronounced. She couldn't sleep lying down anymore, had to prop herself up with pillows. Her feet swelled so badly her shoes didn't fit, and she was terrified, though she tried to hide it. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked one night. "Ruth says you're healthy. The baby's healthy." Ruth said that about other women who didn't make it. Ethan pulled her close, carefully arranging the pillows to support her back. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. Promise?" "Promise." The labor started on a Tuesday morning in late January. Clara woke him before dawn, her face pale, one hand on her belly. "It's time," she said. And just like that, Ethan was back in the worst day of his life. The same fear, the same helplessness, the same certainty that everything he loved was about to be taken away. But Clara was looking at him with trust in her eyes, expecting him to be strong when all he wanted to do was run. So he got up, sent James to fetch Ruth, built up the fire, boiled water because that's what you were supposed to do, even though he'd never understood why, held Clara's hand when the contractions started coming closer together. Ruth arrived and took over with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times. She examined Clara, nodded approval, started giving orders. "You," she pointed at Ethan, "stop hovering. Either make yourself useful or get out." He made himself useful, fetched what Ruth needed, held Clara when she needed holding, walked her around the room between contractions because Ruth said movement helped. Tried not to think about Sarah, about blood, about loss. The labor went on for hours. Clara was strong, stronger than he'd given her credit for, but he could see the exhaustion setting in. Could see the fear, too, the moments between contractions when she'd look at him like she was wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "You're doing great," he told her. "I'm dying." "You're not dying, you're bringing our child into the world, and you're doing it perfectly. There's nothing perfect about this. I'm sweating and screaming and—" She gasped as another contraction hit. Ruth checked her again, looked satisfied. Almost there? Next few contractions, you're going to push. And Clara did. Pushed with everything she had, her hand crushing Ethan's, her voice raw from screaming. He stayed with her, murmuring encouragement he didn't know if she could hear, being the anchor she needed even though he felt like he was drowning. Then suddenly, impossibly, there was a baby. A tiny, angry, squalling baby that Ruth was holding up. And Clara was crying, and Ethan felt something in his chest crack open that had been sealed shut for 4 years. "It's a boy," Ruth said, wrapping the baby in a blanket. "Healthy lungs on this one." She handed the baby to Clara, who took him with shaking hands and looked down at him with wonder. Ethan leaned over them both, hardly daring to breathe, and saw his son for the first time. He was small and red and perfect. Had Clara's nose and a shock of dark hair and hands that waved in the air, like he was already trying to grab onto life. And he was alive. They were both alive. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The baby's crying settled into small huffs and snuffles. Ruth finished her work, checking Clara thoroughly, pronouncing her tired but well. Then she left the three of them alone, closing the door on her way out. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Clara, one hand gently touching his son's tiny head. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but it was quieter now, pushed back by something bigger. "We did it," Clara said. "You did it. I just stood there and tried not to faint." "You did more than that." She looked up at him. "What should we call him?" They'd discussed names but never settled on one, both of them superstitiously afraid to choose before the baby arrived safely. Now Ethan looked at his son and knew immediately. "Thomas," he said. "After my father, Thomas Cross." Clara tested it out. "Thomas. Tommy. I like it. Tom for short, though we'll probably have to distinguish him from Tom Bradshaw somehow. Ours will be the one who doesn't drink all the whiskey in town. That's the hope." They sat together as the winter sun rose outside, casting long shadows across the room. The baby, Tommy, slept in his mother's arms, unaware that he'd just changed everything. That his arrival had proven it was possible to survive loss and love again. That his existence was a gift neither of his parents had been sure they deserved. Ethan thought about Sarah, about Grace, about the family he'd lost. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had shifted. Instead of drowning him, it existed alongside this new love, this new beginning. They were all part of his story now, the loss and the finding, the ending and the new beginning. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara looked at him. "For what?" "For getting on that stagecoach, for staying, for believing in this even when I couldn't." He kissed her forehead. "For giving me a reason to live again." "You gave me one too." She settled back against the pillows, exhausted but content. "We gave each other one." Outside, the town was waking up. Soon people would come by with congratulations and gifts and all the noise that accompanied new life. But for now, it was just the three of them in the quiet house, learning how to be a family. Ethan looked at his wife and his son and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just survival, not just getting through the day, but actual happiness. Fragile and precious and absolutely terrifying, but worth it. Worth every moment of fear, every risk taken, every wall broken down. Worth everything. The first weeks with Tommy were nothing like Ethan had imagined. There was no gentle settling into parenthood, no peaceful moments of father and son bonding while soft music played in the background like some kind of storybook fantasy. Instead, there was screaming at 2 a.m. and the smell of soiled diapers and an exhaustion so complete that Ethan sometimes forgot what day it was. Clara recovered slowly, her body needing time to heal from the trauma of birth. She tried to hide how much pain she was in, but Ethan saw it in the careful way she moved, the grimace she couldn't quite suppress when she picked up the baby. Ruth came by daily for the first week, checking on both of them, offering advice that ranged from helpful to completely contradictory. "Let him cry," she'd say one day. "Babies need to learn they can't have everything they want immediately." Then the next day, "Don't let him cry too long. He needs to know you'll come when he needs you." Ethan wanted to ask which advice was correct, but suspected Ruth would just tell him to figure it out himself. Tommy was a demanding baby. He wanted to eat constantly, never seemed to sleep for more than an hour at a time, and had a cry that could wake the dead. But he was also perfect in that way that all newborns are perfect to their parents. Tiny fingers that wrapped around Ethan's thumb, dark eyes that seemed to look right into him, a smell that was somehow sweet despite everything else. The house that had been so quiet for so long was now filled with noise. Not just Tommy's crying, but Clara singing lullabies at midnight, Ethan's heavy footsteps as he paced the floor trying to soothe a fussy baby, the small sounds of a family learning to exist together. James came by a week after the birth, nervous and holding a badly carved wooden rattle. "Made it myself," he said, his ears turning red. "Thought the baby might like it." Tommy was too young to appreciate it, but Clara thanked him warmly and put it on the shelf where they could see it. After James left, she looked at Ethan with tears in her eyes. "People care about us," she said, like she was still surprised by it. "Yeah, they do. I never had that before. Growing up, it was just me and my aunt, and she wasn't warm, didn't have friends over, didn't let me get close to anyone." She looked down at Tommy, sleeping for once in her arms. "I want him to have different. I want him to grow up knowing he's part of something bigger than just us." "He will. This town. They'll drive you crazy with their gossip and their opinions, but they show up when it matters." And they did. The women brought food, enough to keep Clara from having to cook for weeks. The men offered help with repairs Ethan hadn't had time to finish. Even Tom Bradshaw, who'd never seemed particularly interested in children, stopped by with a bottle of whiskey and a surprisingly gentle look at the baby. "He looks like you," Tom said. "Poor kid. Thanks for that. I'm serious, though. You're doing good, Ethan. Sarah would be proud." It was the first time anyone had mentioned Sarah in relation to Tommy, and it hit harder than Ethan expected. He'd been so focused on making sure Clara and the baby survived that he hadn't let himself think about what Sarah would have thought of all this. Whether she'd be happy he'd found love again, whether she'd approve of the way he was trying to be a father this time. That night, after Clara and Tommy had finally fallen asleep, Ethan went to the storage room where he'd put Sarah's things. He found the journal she'd kept during her pregnancy, the one he'd never been able to read after she died. He opened it now, his hand shaking, and read her words. Most of it was mundane, notes about how she was feeling, worries about whether they'd have enough money, excitement about meeting their daughter. But near the end, there was an entry that made him stop. "I'm afraid, but I'm also ready. Whatever happens, I know Ethan will be all right. He's stronger than he thinks. And if something goes wrong, I hope he finds someone who sees that strength, someone who doesn't let him hide from life, someone who makes him laugh again. He deserves that. He deserves everything." Ethan closed the journal carefully, wiped his eyes, and put it back. Sarah had given him permission to move forward, even before she'd died. It had just taken him 4 years to accept it. When he came back to the bedroom, Clara was awake, nursing Tommy in the dim lamplight. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah, just needed to remember something." "About Sarah?" "About what she wanted for me. For us." He sat on the edge of the bed, watched his son eat with single-minded determination. "I think she'd like you. I think she'd be glad Tommy exists." "I hope so." Clara shifted Tommy to her other side. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in her shadow, like I'm just the second choice, the replacement." "You're not a replacement. You're—" He searched for the right words. "You're the woman who showed up when I'd given up, who refused to let me stay dead inside, who fought for us when I was too scared to fight for myself. That's not being second. That's being exactly who I needed." She smiled, tired but genuine. "That's almost romantic." "I'm working on it." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and small victories. Tommy's first smile, which Clara swore was real, even though Ethan was pretty sure it was gas. His first laugh, which definitely was real and sounded like pure joy. The way he'd calm down when Ethan sang to him, even though Ethan couldn't carry a tune to save his life. Clara's sewing business picked up again once she'd recovered, though she had to work around Tommy's schedule now. Annie helped more, taking on the simpler orders while Clara handled the intricate work. They'd set up a cradle, the one Ethan had finished years ago, in Clara's sewing room so she could work while Tommy slept. Ethan divided his time between the workshop and helping with the baby. He'd never been particularly good at domestic tasks, but he learned. Changed diapers without gagging. Walked Tommy around the house at midnight singing off-key lullabies. Made breakfast one-handed while holding a fussy infant in the other arm. James proved surprisingly helpful with Tommy. The boy had a gentle touch and infinite patience, and Tommy seemed to like him. On days when both Ethan and Clara had urgent work, James would watch the baby, walking him around the workshop and talking to him about leather and tools as if the 4-month-old could understand. "He's good practice," James said when Ethan thanked him. "Someday I'll have my own kids. Might as well learn now." By spring, they'd settled into something resembling a routine. It wasn't smooth. There were still bad nights and frustrated mornings and moments when Ethan wondered if he was doing any of this right. But there were also good moments. Tommy reaching for him with chubby hands, Clara laughing at something ridiculous the baby had done. The three of them together in the evening, tired but content. The town watched them with approval. The tragic widower had found happiness again. The mail-order bride who wasn't supposed to stay had become one of them. The baby was healthy and growing. It was the kind of story people liked, redemption and second chances and love conquering fear. But Ethan knew it was more complicated than that. Love didn't conquer fear. Love just made you decide the fear was worth facing. And second chances didn't erase first losses. They just taught you that loss wasn't the end of everything. On Tommy's first birthday, they had a small party. Just close friends, people who'd been part of their journey. Mrs. Henderson brought a cake. Ruth brought stern advice about not spoiling the child. James brought another carved toy, this one a horse that actually looked like a horse. Tommy, oblivious to the significance of the day, was more interested in the paper the gifts were wrapped in than the gifts themselves. He sat on the floor, tearing paper into smaller and smaller pieces, laughing at the sound it made. "He's perfect," Clara said, watching him. "He's destroying your kitchen," Ethan pointed out. Same thing. That night, after everyone had left and Tommy had finally fallen asleep, they sat on the porch together. It was May, warm enough to be outside comfortably, and the stars were bright overhead. "A year ago, I was terrified," Clara said, "pregnant and scared and convinced something would go wrong." "Me too. But nothing did. Or rather, lots of things went wrong, but none of them were catastrophic. We got through it." "We did." She leaned against him. "I want another one." Ethan's heart jumped. "Another baby?" "Not right away. Tommy's exhausting enough. But someday. I want him to have siblings. Want this house to be full of noise and chaos and life." He thought about it, really thought. A year ago, the idea would have terrified him. Now it just felt right. "Okay. Okay? Yeah, someday, when we're ready. You're not scared?" "I'm terrified. But I'm starting to think being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. It just means it matters." She kissed him, soft and certain. "When did you get so wise?" "I married you, didn't I? That was pretty smart." She laughed, and the sound carried across the quiet evening, mixing with the crickets and the distant sound of the creek. The second pregnancy came 2 years later when Tommy was walking and talking and getting into everything. This time, Ethan was less terrified and more prepared. He knew what to expect, knew that Clara was strong enough to handle it, knew that fear was just part of the process. The labor was shorter, but harder. A girl this time, born in the middle of a summer thunderstorm, screaming her way into the world with determination that reminded Ethan of Clara. They named her Rose, after Clara's mother, and she had her mother's blue eyes and a temperament that suggested she'd be trouble. Tommy was fascinated by his sister. He'd sit next to her cradle for hours, talking to her in his toddler gibberish, trying to share his toys, even though she was too young to appreciate them. Ethan would watch them together and feel something settle in his chest, the sense that this was what family was supposed to be. Messy and loud and full of love. A third child came 3 years after Rose. Another boy, quieter than Tommy had been, with Ethan's dark hair and a thoughtful expression even as an infant. They named him Samuel, after the man who'd pushed Ethan to stop hiding from life, and Sam Webb stood as godfather with tears in his eyes. The house expanded with each child. Ethan built additions, added rooms, turned the small cabin into something that could actually hold a growing family. His workshop did well. He'd taken on 2 more apprentices, and Cross Saddlery had a reputation for quality that brought customers from neighboring territories. Clara's sewing business evolved. With 3 children, she couldn't take on as much work. But what she did take was exceptional. She'd trained Annie well enough that the girl could handle most orders. And together they'd built something that supported both their families. But it wasn't just work and children. Ethan and Clara made time for each other too. Sunday walks after church, leaving the kids with Mrs. Henderson. Quiet evenings on the porch after the children were asleep. Moments stolen in the middle of chaos to remember why they'd chosen each other. They fought sometimes, argued about money and discipline and whose turn it was to deal with whatever disaster the children had created. But they always came back together, always remembered that they were on the same side. Years passed in that strange way they do when you're busy living. Tommy grew tall and serious, showing an aptitude for leather work that made Ethan proud. Rose turned out to be as stubborn as both her parents combined, with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind. Samuel was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over arguments and found compromises. The town changed too. New buildings went up, the railroad came through, bringing more people and opportunities. Salvation Creek grew from a rough frontier settlement into something resembling a real town, with a proper school and a bank and enough churches to satisfy everyone's particular brand of faith. Ethan watched it all with the perspective of someone who'd been there when it was nothing. He'd seen the town bury its dead and celebrate its victories. He'd been part of its story, and it had been part of his. Mrs. Henderson died the winter Tommy turned 10. She went peacefully in her sleep, which was more than most people got. At her funeral, Ethan stood with Clara and their children and thought about the letters she'd written, the elaborate scheme she'd concocted because Sarah had asked her to, the way she'd given him a second chance even when he hadn't wanted one. "She saved us," Clara whispered. "Yeah, she did." Ruth eventually retired, passing her midwife duties to a younger woman who'd trained under her. Tom Bradshaw sobered up after a close call with a horse convinced him he wasn't immortal. Samuel Webb's hair went white, but he still showed up at the workshop every few weeks to critique Ethan's work and tell stories about the old days. And Ethan got older. His hair grayed at the temples. His hands developed arthritis that made fine work harder. His knee, the one he'd injured years ago, started bothering him more. But he was alive, and that mattered. One evening, 15 years after Clara had first arrived, they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Tommy was 17 now, already taller than Ethan. Rose was 12, all sharp angles and sharper wit. Samuel was 9, reading a book in the fading light instead of playing with his siblings. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd gotten on that stagecoach?" Clara asked. "If you'd let me leave like you planned?" "Sometimes." "What do you think?" Ethan considered it. "I think I'd still be living in that house alone, still working myself to death, still convinced that was all I deserved. And me? You'd have found somewhere else, someone else probably. You're too strong to have given up. Maybe, but I wouldn't have had this." She gestured to the children, the house, the life they'd built. "I wouldn't have had you. You almost didn't anyway. I tried pretty hard to push you away." "You did, but I'm stubborn." "That's one word for it." She laughed, the same laugh he'd fallen in love with years ago. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" "No. You?" "Not even a little." She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture so familiar it didn't require thought. "I know it wasn't perfect. I know we struggled. I know there were times we both wanted to quit, but we didn't. No, we didn't. No." Tommy called from the yard, something about Samuel cheating at whatever game they were playing. Rose's voice rose in defense of her younger brother. The familiar sounds of their children fighting and making up and fighting again. "I should probably—" Clara started to stand. "Let them work it out. They're fine." She settled back down, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the sun set over the mountains. The same mountains that had seemed so hostile when Clara first arrived. The same landscape that had tried to break her, and failed. "Sarah would be proud of you," Clara said quietly. "Of all of this. The family you built. The life you chose." It was the first time she'd mentioned Sarah in years. Not because Sarah was forgotten. Her memory was woven into the fabric of their family, mentioned in stories and remembered in small traditions, but because the grief had finally gentled into something that didn't hurt to touch. "She'd be proud of you too," Ethan said, "for putting up with me, for making this work when it shouldn't have. It should have worked. We just had to fight for it." And they had fought, against fear and grief and the weight of expectations, against a town that had opinions about everything, against their own worst instincts and the scars they both carried. They'd fought, and they'd won, though the victory had looked different than either of them expected. That night, after the children were finally in bed and the house was quiet, Ethan found the box where he'd kept Sarah's things. The journal, the locket, the letters Mrs. Henderson had written pretending to be him. He looked through them one last time, remembering who he'd been when all this started. A broken man living in a silent house, convinced that love was just a prelude to loss. He'd been wrong. Love was messy and complicated and sometimes painful, but it was also the only thing that made life worth living. The only thing that turned existence into something more. He put the box away and went to find Clara. She was in their bedroom, brushing out her hair, and when she saw him in the doorway, she smiled. "Can't sleep?" "Didn't try yet. The kids wore you out today." "The kids wear me out every day." He crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her from behind, looked at their reflection in the mirror. Two people who'd found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose. Two people who'd built something real from broken pieces. "I love you," he said. "I know." "Do you?" "Because I don't say it enough. I get caught up in work and children and everything else, and I forget to say it. But Clara, I love you. More than I thought I could love anyone after Sarah. Different, but just as much." She turned in his arms, looked up at him with those blue eyes that had first caught his attention 15 years ago. "I love you too, even when you're grumpy and stubborn and convinced you know better than everyone else." "I do know better." "See? Exactly that." He kissed her, and it was the same and different from all the kisses that had come before. Same love, same connection, but deeper now, rooted in years of shared experience and accumulated trust. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and clear. Inside, the house was warm and full of the evidence of lives being lived. Children's drawings on the walls, boots by the door, dishes in the sink waiting to be washed. The beautiful, ordinary mess of a family. Ethan thought about the man he'd been before Clara arrived. The ghost who'd moved through days without living them. The widower who'd been so afraid of losing again that he'd tried not to have anything to lose. That man was gone. Replaced by someone who'd learned that the risk of loss was the price of love, that you couldn't have one without accepting the other, that the only way to truly honor the people you'd lost was to keep living, keep loving, keep opening yourself to both joy and pain. He'd learned it slowly, reluctantly, fighting every step, but he'd learned it. Years later, when Ethan was old and his children were grown with children of their own, someone would ask him about that winter when Clara arrived. About how a mail-order bride sent by mistake had changed everything. And he'd tell them the truth. That love wasn't about perfection or destiny or fate. It was about choice. About showing up even when it was hard. About building something together from whatever broken pieces you both brought to the table. He'd tell them about Sarah, who he'd loved first and lost too soon. About Clara, who'd shown up when he'd given up and refused to let him stay dead inside. About the children they'd raised and the life they'd built, and the way grief and joy could exist in the same heart without canceling each other out. He'd tell them that the greatest transformation wasn't healing, because some wounds never fully healed. It was learning to live with the scars, to carry loss and love in the same hands, to accept that being alive meant being vulnerable to both extraordinary pain and extraordinary joy. And he'd tell them that it was worth it. Every moment of fear, every risk taken, every wall broken down. Worth it for the warmth of a house full of voices, for the feeling of his wife's hand in his after decades together, for the knowledge that he'd chosen to live instead of just survive. That was the real story. Not the romance of a mail-order bride and a lonely widower, but the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate griefs and decided to build something new. A woman who wasn't supposed to come. A man who'd sworn never to love again. One winter that changed everything. And a life full of noise and chaos and ordinary miracles that proved sometimes mistakes were the best things that ever happened. Sometimes the wrong person turned out to be exactly right. And sometimes, when you'd lost everything, the only way forward was to risk losing it all again. That was the lesson Ethan Cross learned in a small Wyoming town in a winter that should have been just another season of survival. That living meant accepting loss as part of the bargain. That love required courage. That second chances didn't erase first heartbreaks, but could exist alongside them. And that the greatest act of faith wasn't believing in a perfect future. It was choosing to show up for an uncertain one, together, despite the fear, because of the hope. In the end, that was all any of them could do. Show up, choose love, keep going. And that, somehow, was enough.